You may be seated. So I kind of actually love that reading that Cheryl did from the book of Exodus, and it's not for any particularly spiritual or theological reason. I just love the phrase, the flesh pots of Egypt. Now, before you get all excited, the phrase flesh pots of Egypt has been kind of misused by evangelical preachers to mean any kind of debauchery involving sins of the flesh, i.e. generally sex. But that is just ignorant because that's not what it means. Flesh pots really, literally just means a big old pot of stew. And the Israelites were getting all nostalgic about what they had to eat back in Egypt. And also, apropos of nothing particularly theological, there is a bluegrass band called the Flesh Pots of Egypt. And Reverend June introduced me to them. They are actually from a Lutheran seminary, and they bill themselves as exploring how Lutheran worship would sound if the Protestant Reformation had started in 19th century Appalachia instead of 16th century Germany. And I'm fairly sure that church music in general would have been much better if that had happened. Could I have a few bars of Mighty Fortress is Our God? Never mind. Can you do any bluegrass? No worries. That's my digression for the day. Now on to the sermon.
Don't encourage us.
I love encouraging you. I never know what's going to happen. So that's my digression. And so remember way back on Easter Sunday? Yeah, and as June said, I will remind you once again, Easter is a 50-day season, not just one day, and we're still in the middle of it. Anyhow, back on Easter Sunday, I kind of ruined butterflies for you all by explaining that the butterfly goes into its cocoon or chrysalis or whatever and basically dies. My wife refers to caterpillars as butterfly seeds. And the caterpillar dissolves inside its cocoon into this sticky, gooey, shapeless mass of gunk. And somehow, when the time is right, and I have no idea how the gunk knows anything, the gunk begins to form into a body with legs and a head and an itty-bitty little brain and wings. And it never had wings before, but now it has wings. It's very different. And then amazingly, from the cocoon emerges a beautiful butterfly. But first, the goo. And I imagine this must have been highly disconcerting for the caterpillar. I mean, think about it. If you're a caterpillar, I'm pretty sure you can't possibly imagine being anything else. I mean, can you imagine being something other than a human being? You know, a butterfly is a very different thing from a caterpillar. And the phenomenon is called metamorphosis. And the German writer Franz Kafka famously wrote a story called The Metamorphosis. In German, it's die Verwandlung, which can also mean the transformation. Transformation. And the gist of it is that the central character in the story, Gregor Samsa, wakes up one morning to discover that he's been transformed into, in Kafka's words, a monstrous vermin. And most people assume he was just a giant cockroach. And he wakes up in his bed, and he's lying on his back with his 6 legs waving in the air, and he doesn't know what to do. Anyhow, it's a really depressing story. Don't bother. And while butterflies are much nicer than cockroaches, The transformation from caterpillar to butterfly is every bit as shocking as waking up as a cockroach. And I don't think there's really any kind of comparison we can think of that bespeaks as huge a transformation as the lowly caterpillar makes in emerging into a butterfly. I have to digress again. When I was really little, my mother tried to teach me that, bugs and things were just a part of the natural world and I shouldn't be afraid of them or anything, because she was a gardener and she understood that, you need pollinators, you need worms. Didn't mean she liked them. So one day, she screwed up all her courage and got a caterpillar on her finger and showed it to me and said, see, it's got this fur, it's kind of cute, it crawls along, it's adorable. And she put it on my hand and I went, ew! Anyhow, our theme for this Easter season has been emergence and transformation. And emerging is inherent in the Christian story and in our story as followers of Jesus. But emergence also means trusting the divine when we aren't sure what's next for us. And I'm pretty sure the caterpillar had no idea what was next while it waits in the dark and the goo. And I'm really sure the goo has no idea. And frankly, we never know what's next, really, do we? But that's where transformation happens. And transformation means doing something new. For the butterfly stretching into the fullness of new potential, it begins to sense a calling to new heights. The caterpillar crawled around on the ground. The butterfly soars through the air. So the expansion of wings, however, means something profound for the butterfly. It cannot ever go back into the cocoon. Not even if it wanted to. It's time to leave it behind. Now, the Israelites that left Egypt were aching for freedom, and yet when faced with the disorientation of all that was new and unfamiliar in the wilderness, a lot of them began whining to go back. Cheryl, you did a great job reading, but you didn't really sound whiny enough. They were really complaining. Do any of y'all remember Reverend Elder Don Eastman? Anybody? Yeah, some. Those of you who've been around for a while. He ministered here with us a few years back, and he had a name for this phenomenon. He called the Israelites in this situation the Back to Egypt Committee. Because doing something new is hard. And it's tempting to be nostalgic about the past. And the Israelites actually thought being slaves back in Egypt must be easier than journeying through the wilderness for 40 years towards the land of promise. In another similar passage, they complained again that the food was better back in Egypt. In the book of Numbers, it's recorded that they moaned, "If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we used to eat in Egypt for free from the River Nile, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now there's nothing but this miserable stuff to eat." And this miserable stuff was the manna that God graciously provided fresh every morning. Interestingly, to me at least, the Hebrew word for manna, which is manna, is a bit of a play on words. In Hebrew, manna basically means, what the heck is that? So essentially, what the Israelites were doing was equating the comparative value of freedom versus spicy food. Freedom, spicy food, freedom. I'm not seeing much of a contest there, and it was all because they couldn't leave the past behind. And letting go of the past requires deep trust in the God who has promised to be with us always. And frankly, it also requires a lot of time and patience. Not my strong suit. Butterflies look but ugly when they first emerge from the cocoon. They're not quite as ugly as a cockroach, but pretty gross. They're all wrinkly, kind of like our skin wrinkles when we sit in the bathtub too long. And they certainly can't fly right away. The butterfly has to allow air to dry out its wings and wait for the wings to expand. It's an amazing process. If you ever watch a butterfly emerging, one of the fascinating things to notice is how much larger the butterfly is when it's done unfolding. It becomes much larger than the chrysalis that encased it. And that unfolding takes time and patience, and sometimes it requires a great leap of faith. The butterfly has to take a leap of faith, because what does a caterpillar know of flying? Caterpillars crawl. So you might excuse the butterfly for wanting to cling to whatever branch it's hatched on. You know, what fear might paralyze it before taking flight, to have undergone such a huge transformation from a crawling caterpillar to a cocoon? What possible frame of reference could a butterfly have for flying? What possible frame of reference could we have for flying? But once it's out of the cocoon, the butterfly's wings dry out and they fluff up, and now it's got to let go of the branch. And it's the same with the Israelites. In the reading from Exodus, they're in the middle of the wilderness and they're wandering after all the plagues and the splitting of the Red Sea and the defeat of their oppressors. The Israelites are liberated. They are free. But they're finding life in the wilderness hard. If only we had died in the land of Egypt when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill. And they've forgotten the suffering they underwent in slavery, and they're uncomfortable with the new difficulties. And sometimes we get so used to suffering that liberation feels strange. I can just hear them now. We never did it that way before. And there's a fear that can grow within us in response to the unknown. And perhaps the Israelites, in their fear, thought that the suffering they could remember was somehow easier than the suffering of the unknown. But God gave the Israelites a unique opportunity to learn how to trust in God's provision. In Egypt, the Israelites had something they recognized, but like the caterpillar, they had no concept of what awaited them after liberation. The land into which God was sending them, as well as the food that God was providing them, it was all so different, and yet so much more than they had in Egypt. But they didn't know that until they experienced it. You know, the butterfly only knew the butterfly only knew the stems and leaves that it crawled on and feasted on as a caterpillar, and the moment before it takes flight is so crucial as its wings are unfurled, but also because the proboscis, that's a feeding tube through which the butterfly feeds, is still forming in this precious time of waiting and just hanging out. Now, a couple of years ago, Janet and I rescued a butterfly from our dog. And we put it in a container to recover from the shock of Lola grabbing it. And we gave it some fruit to munch on while it was waiting, and it was so cool to watch its little proboscis uncurl and start slurping up fruit juice. So that's got to happen too before it can launch, which to me is a reminder that important things may be happening while we're waiting for the next thing. While we think nothing's going on, but it is. And when it's finally ready, the butterfly experiences the full reality of which it was made for: flight. That's what it was meant to do. The Israelites only knew the certainty and regularity of slavery, but in that crucial moment after liberation, before entering into the land of promise, God provided the Israelites a taste of something so much greater than they had ever had in their past. And it's easy to reminisce about the good old days, and yet what flight into newness is God calling us to take? What is God calling us to leave behind in our own lives, in our lives as a faith community, so that we can journey forward into the abundant life that God is calling us to live? We are being transformed, each one of us, in our own way. And for some, this change comes gradually, unfolding over a lifetime, a process of growing, nurtured by the slow accumulation of wisdom. And for others, the shift comes in a sudden rush, accelerated by some breakthrough experience, a burst of spiritual energy, propelling the spirit forward. And for most, I suspect it's a combination of the two, years of steady searching, punctuated by moments of dazzling insight. We are all being constantly transformed. No soul stays the same, and every soul contains within it infinite possibilities. Now watch this. Amen.